Okay, so imagine this one of the most famous kings in history. David has just been caught in a huge mistake, serious stuff. Like adultery and murder level bad. And now, in 2 Samuel 12 and 13, we're diving into what happens next. Repentance, heartbreak, and some really intense family drama. Trust me, it's messy, emotional, and honestly kind of relatable in a shocking way. So stick around because we're gonna see how sin, forgiveness, and consequences all collide in David's life, and his family won't be untouched either. Alright, so let's rewind a little and set the scene here. David, the king, has just done something really messy. He's had an affair with Bathsheba, and then, well, things got even worse because he arranged for her husband to be killed. Yeah, it's pretty dark, and honestly, it's one of those moments in the Bible where you see even the greatest people mess up big time. So God, who obviously sees everything, isn't just going to let this slide. Enter Nathan, the prophet. Nathan's job here is kind of wild. He's sent straight to confront David. But here's the thing, he doesn't just come in and say, David, you did this terrible thing. No, he uses a story. Yeah, he tells a parable. This little story about a rich man who takes a poor man's only lamb, and it's kind of ridiculous, right? But the point hits David immediately, and yeah, he sees the injustice in someone else's actions, and for the first time, he starts to realize, oh, wait a second. That's me. This is where those big principles start to pop up, and honestly, they're the kind of things we can all relate to, even today. First off, concealed sin hurts. David had been hiding what he did, trying to cover it up, and it was eating him alive. You can almost feel it when you read Psalm 32. He talks about how keeping the sin secret weighed him down, right down to the bone. It wasn't just guilt in his head, it physically affected him. That's the thing about hidden sin. It doesn't just mess with your conscience. It messes with your life. And here's where Nathan's story works like a mirror. When David hears the parable, the weight of what he's done, even though he hasn't admitted it yet, just slams into him. You can almost hear him thinking, oh no, that's me. That's exactly what I did. And that leads us to the second principle confessed sin heals. Now, this is where David shows why he's remembered as a man after God's own heart. As soon as Nathan points out the truth, David doesn't make excuses. He doesn't argue. He doesn't try to blame Bathsheba or even his own circumstances. Nope, he says, basically, I've sinned against the Lord. Boom, just like that. Right there. The confession comes, and you can almost feel the relief, like a huge weight has lifted. And that's what's so striking about this part of the story. And God isn't just waiting to punish David. He's waiting for David to come clean, because once David does, the healing can begin. Concealed sin hurts. Confessed sin heals. It's that simple. And yet, seeing it in action with David makes it really human. Now, here's another subtle but super important principle: don't hold others to a higher standard than yourself. Nathan's parable is genius because David could see the sin of the rich man, right? He's outraged by it. And here's the weird part, he could see that clearly, but he couldn't see his own sin in the same way until it's reflected back at him. And we do that too, don't we? We're quick to judge others for their mistakes, but when it comes to ourselves, we tend to rationalize, minimize, or just ignore it. Now, David's story is basically a reality check on that. The way Nathan frames the story forces David to look at himself in a way that bypasses his ego and defenses. He can't argue with the injustice anymore because it's his own actions being exposed in the mirror of the story. And the human element here, honestly, is so relatable. We all need a Nathan in our lives sometimes, someone who can hold up that mirror without fear, without flinching, so we can finally see the truth. And the response: David doesn't hesitate. He repents immediately. This is key. He recognizes that he's been wrong, and he's ready to get right with God. There's no dragging his feet, no bargaining, no delaying. He just says it, acknowledges it, and faces it head on. And God responds not with anger that we might expect, but with forgiveness. That's what makes this so powerful. God's forgiveness isn't a casual, dismissive thing here. It's full, it's complete, and it's coupled with restoration. David experiences the Lord's grace firsthand, and it changes everything. There's this moment where you can almost feel the tension break the moment when hidden guilt and shame start to be replaced with relief, with restoration, and a chance to start anew. Now, think about the timing too. God gives David the opportunity to confess privately before sin is exposed publicly. That's a mercy that's easy to overlook. Nathan confronts David. Yes. But before that, God had likely been giving David space and time to come clean on his own. And this is such a human point because sometimes we resist confessing, even when we know we should. We hope maybe it will go away. Maybe no one will notice. Maybe we can fix it quietly. But eventually, the truth has a way of coming out. David's quick confession after being confronted shows that the best thing we can do is face it early, deal with it, and experience the healing before consequences grow worse. And it's worth noting, too, that this story isn't just about one individual sin. It's about how sin affects relationships, family, and community. David's actions set off a ripple effect, and even though he's forgiven, the consequences of his actions don't just vanish. There's a natural law at play here. What we sow, we eventually reap. That makes the story feel raw and real. It's not just moralizing, it's real life. And that's why these principles: concealed sin hurts, confessed sin heals, and don't hold others to a higher standard than yourself aren't just abstract ideas. They're deeply human truths. We see them in David's life, and we can see echoes of them in our own. Plus, the way this story is told, it's dramatic and engaging. Nathan's parable, the confrontation, David's instant realization, it reads like a narrative that could happen in any family or any community. You can feel the guilt, the tension, the moral awakening. And that's the thing about storytelling like this. It draws you in. It's not just a lesson, it's a lived experience, a moment of reckoning. David's repentance is immediate, yes, but it's also profound. He doesn't just say the words, he internalizes them. And God's forgiveness shows the transformative power of grace. This sets the stage for everything that follows, because while God forgives, he also shows that actions have consequences, and that personal integrity and accountability matter deeply. And here's the human takeaway facing your mistakes: owning up to them and being willing to accept guidance or confrontation. It's painful, sure, but it's the path to healing. David's story is extreme, yes, but the principle's totally applicable. We all hide things we shouldn't. We all need to confess. And we all need to remember not to judge others while excusing ourselves. And that's why this moment with Nathan is so crucial. It's the turning point, the moment where David moves from deception and guilt to transparency and restoration. And it's messy, and it's human. And that's exactly what makes it so real and relatable. So in this story, we see a full spectrum: sin, guilt, confrontation, reflection, confession, forgiveness. It's a chain reaction that changes a life and sets a precedent for personal and family responsibility. And if we let it sink in, it has lessons for us today about honesty, integrity, and the courage to face our own mistakes, no matter how big they are. It's a reminder that no one is above their actions, but also that grace is always available when we're willing to turn around and face it honestly. Okay? So picking up right where we left off, things get really heavy here. David and Bathsheba had just gone through this intense confrontation and repentance moment, right? But even after all that, life doesn't suddenly become easy or smooth. The Bible tells us that the child born from David's affair with Bathsheba, the first child didn't survive. And wow, just imagining that heartbreak is tough. David mourned deeply. He fasted, he wept, he pleaded with God, hoping maybe, just maybe, God would show mercy and let the child live. You can almost feel him pacing, wrestling with hope and grief, just desperately wanting to hold on to his child. And there's something so raw about that. This wasn't some abstract theological idea, it was real life, real pain, and a father's heart laid bare when he says, "While the child was alive, I fasted and wept, for I said, who can tell whether the Lord will be gracious to me that the child may live? But now he is dead. Why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I shall go to him, but he shall not return to me." You can hear the mix of resignation and faith. There's sorrow, yes, but also a kind of quiet trust in God's justice and mercy. And here's a key point that comes up, one that theologians call the age of accountability. Basically, God, in His grace, takes children who haven't yet reached the point where they can knowingly make a choice for Him. He takes them into His care. Life may end for them on earth, but their souls are in God's hands. And it's humbling, honestly, because it reminds us of the gentleness and mercy of God. Children, little ones, they aren't left outside of grace, they are brought to be with Him, and we can take some comfort in that. Even amid the raw sorrow, David, even while grieving, seems to understand this in his heart. He knows the child is gone from his sight, but not from God's love. That doesn't make the pain any easier, of course. In fact, it's probably bittersweet, but it sets the stage for a story of redemption and hope that comes immediately afterward. Because right after this morning, David comforts Bathsheba, and they go on to have another child, Solomon. Now, think about the emotional roller coaster for a second. They've just lost a child. They've gone through shame, repentance, and deep sorrow. And then, life gives them this incredible new beginning. Solomon is born, and the narrative doesn't just gloss over it. The text emphasizes that the Lord loved Solomon, and He even gives him the name Jedediah, which literally means beloved of the Lord. That's a direct expression of God's love, and it's remarkable when you think about it. After all the sin and sorrow, God chooses to bring life, joy, and purpose into this family. And Solomon's name, in Hebrew, roots back to shalom, peace. There's something poetic about that, right? It's like God is saying, here's peace after the storm, here's restoration, here's a purpose that extends beyond just this moment. It's also fascinating when you consider Solomon's place among David's children. He wasn't the only child Bathsheba had, but his birth is framed as especially significant. God, in His plan, uses this line to eventually bring forth the Messiah, the Savior. And so, what we're seeing here isn't just about one baby surviving or one family moment. It's a glimpse into God's broader plan to redeem and renew. It's an example of how God can take brokenness, sin, grief, and mistakes and use them to create something meaningful and purposeful. And it hits on a principle that's really important. God forgives repentant sinners and can bring renewed purpose not just to their lives, but to the generations that follow. David's sin had consequences, yes, and they were heavy, but the Lord didn't leave the family in ruin. Instead, He weaves grace, mercy, and a new beginning through Solomon. It's a deeply human moment, too, because you can picture David and Bathsheba holding this new child, maybe feeling the weight of past mistakes, but also sensing hope and love. There's a mixture of joy and lingering sorrow, of gratitude and awe. That just feels raw and real, and I think that's what makes this so relatable. Life is messy, mistakes have consequences, grief is real, and yet hope can emerge, restoration can happen, grace can come through. Even in the middle of pain, God's love is present, and He can turn situations that seem broken into something beautiful and purposeful. Solomon's birth isn't just a story of a king having another son, it's a story of God bringing life and purpose out of failure and loss. And the text doesn't shy away from the fact that David and Bathsheba had already experienced tragedy with the loss of their first child. That reality is included, it doesn't get erased. And that makes the story even more poignant, because it acknowledges human grief. It doesn't sugarcoat the sorrow, it's honest about the pain, the mourning, the deep emotional cost, and yet it also points to God's sovereignty, love, and redemption. And there's something so human about the way David handles it, too. He mourns. Yes, he prays, he fasts, he grieves, but he doesn't despair. When the child dies, he doesn't spiral into hopelessness. He says, "I shall go to him, but he shall not return to me." There's a recognition here of the limits of human control, but also a trust in God's ultimate care. And then, in turning to Bathsheba, comforting her, and welcoming Solomon, he steps into the restoration and hope God is offering. That transition from mourning to the birth of Solomon is so powerful because it captures the human experience of grief and joy intertwined. We see sorrow for what's lost, but we also see anticipation and love for what comes next. And God's involvement in naming Solomon Jedediah is a reminder that this new beginning is part of his plan, not just a human response. It's intentional, sacred, and meaningful, and it underscores the idea that God can use forgiven sinners to fulfill his purposes. David's past mistakes don't disqualify him from being part of God's larger plan. Rather, his repentance, his openness to God, and his willingness to confront his sin allow God to weave a new purpose through his life. And that principle, it's huge. It's like God saying, "I can take your failures, your sorrow, your grief, and still create something beautiful that lasts beyond you." And that's exactly what happens here with Solomon. So, as we reflect on this, the story is simultaneously tragic and hopeful. Tragic because of the loss of the first child, the human grief, and the weight of consequences. Hopeful because God's mercy, love, and purpose break through with Solomon's birth. We see the interplay of sorrow and joy, human mistakes and divine forgiveness, grief and new life. And it all points to a broader truth that God's grace is big enough to cover our failures, and his plans can still move forward through our brokenness, bringing restoration, purpose, and a legacy that extends into future generations. It's a deeply human, deeply emotional story, but it's also profoundly theological and transformative, showing us how God's love, even after tragedy and sin, can create peace, hope, and life. Alright, now let's shift gears a bit and talk about David's role in the military side of things, because after all the personal drama, life doesn't pause for kings, even for someone like David. So, the scene is set with Joab, David's nephew and also the commander of his army. Joab has been leading the campaign against Rabbah, the capital of the Ammonites, and he's doing a lot of heavy lifting. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Joab isn't just reporting on the battle, he's actively encouraging David to step up and join in. And this is layered, because you can see Joab's strategy isn't just about winning a city, it's also about motivating the king. Joab knows David has a history of, well, letting things slide when he's not directly involved. Remember chapter 11, that's where David's absence from the battlefield gave him way too much free time, which led to temptation, poor decisions, and, well, Bathsheba. Joab's basically nudging David, saying, "Hey, king, you need to be here. Don't just sit back this time. Let's get involved, lead the troops, and show everyone what we're made of." And you can almost picture David getting that message. There's probably some tension, some internal reflection. Okay, I've messed up before, but now is my chance to get it right. So David gathers the people, heads out, and joins the campaign against Rabbah. And the text really takes a moment to emphasize what they achieved. They capture the city, they take the spoils, and here's the detail that just hits you. David takes the crown from the enemy king's head. And not just any crown, the text says it weighed a talent of gold. That's around 75 pounds. Imagine trying to balance that on your head. It's almost comical if you think about it, but also a powerful symbol of victory, power, and the tangible results of strategy and leadership. And then there's the rest of the spoils, brought out in abundance, showing not just victory, but the full scale of what the army accomplished. But here's a really human element that stands out: what they do with the conquered people. Normally, in the brutal context of ancient warfare, David could have just executed the entire population. That was sadly common, right? But instead, he conscripts them to work saws, iron picks, axes, and makes them labor in the brickworks. On the surface, It might sound harsh, but compared to mass execution, it's actually an act of mercy. It's a practical, human approach to victory. The city is conquered, the people are controlled, but life is preserved, and they're given work. You can see David's mind at work here, balancing justice, mercy, and strategic control. There's a lot of human calculation happening, a lot of leadership decisions being made on the fly, and there's this interesting contrast with his past mistakes. Earlier, when he was absent from the battlefield, poor choices spiraled into personal sin with Bathsheba. Now, we see him actively taking responsibility, leading, and executing strategy. There's an element of redemption here, not just spiritually, but in how he fulfills his kingly duties. He's being proactive, present, and fully engaged in responsibilities that he previously neglected. And it's not just about the battle itself, it's about demonstrating integrity and discipline, showing that he's capable of leading men effectively and reinforcing the structure of the kingdom. There's a real human story embedded in this military narrative, the weight of past errors, the chance to correct them, and the tangible consequences of leadership. You can almost imagine the emotional mix for David: pride in the victory, reflection on the past, and perhaps a quiet determination not to let personal failings undermine his role again. And Joab's role here is fascinating, because he's not just a military general, he's a mentor of sorts, a motivator, someone who understands both the strategy of war and the psychology of the king. By pushing David to join the fight, Joab is ensuring the king doesn't repeat old mistakes. There's this subtle interplay between authority, guidance, and human ambition that makes this more than just a story of conquest. And then, after the victory, David and the people return to Jerusalem carrying not just the spoils, but a renewed sense of duty and accomplishment. There's a closure here, a full circle moment. The king who once stayed back, who faltered, now actively participates, leads his men, secures the city, and manages the aftermath responsibly. It's a story that shows the tension between personal failure and the ability to rise again, the human capacity to learn from mistakes, and the way leadership can be both tested and redeemed. And if you think about it, it's easy to relate to this, right? We all have moments where we've fallen short, where our absence or lack of action caused problems, and yet there's always an opportunity to step in, take responsibility, and do better the next time. David's campaign against Rabbah, guided by Joab's insight and strategy, becomes this narrative of redemption, human decision-making, and the contrast between past errors and present accountability. It's both a tactical military story and a deeply human one, because you can see the emotions, the stakes, and the lessons in leadership woven through it. From the encouragement of Joab, to David's active participation, to the handling of the spoils and the people. The story is alive with the realities of human leadership, responsibility, and the consequences of prior mistakes. And that, I think, is why this section of David's life resonates. It's about the weight of leadership, the necessity of presence and accountability, and the chance to redeem yourself after failing in the past. It's strategic, yes, but it's also profoundly human, showing both the pressures and the potential for growth inherent in leadership. Alright, so now we're diving into one of the most intense and honestly tragic parts of David's family story, Amnon and Tamar. It's tough, but it's also really human, because it's about desire, manipulation, grief, and the devastating consequences of sin. So, let's set the scene. David has a lot of children, and among them is Tamar, his daughter with Macha, described as lovely, beautiful, and pure. Then there's Amnon, David's firstborn son by another wife. And here's where things start to spiral. Amnon becomes obsessed with Tamar. And when I say obsessed, I mean it consumes him. He can't eat, he can't sleep, he's fixated. But it's not love. Not real love. It's lust, and it's completely inappropriate against both moral law and familial boundaries. And this is where Jonadab comes in. Jonadab is Amnon's cousin, and let's just say he's a really bad influence. He sees Amnon's distress, and instead of guiding him toward wisdom or restraint, he gives him a plan. He tells Amnon to pretend to be sick, so David will send Tamar to take care of him, to prepare food, so he can get her alone. Yeah, it's manipulative and cruel. And Amnon, blinded by desire, takes the advice It's like watching a slow-motion train wreck. You know it's going to end badly, but the characters can't see it yet. So Tamar goes to her brother, obediently, thinking she's just helping a sick sibling. She kneads the flour, makes the cakes, brings them to him, and places them before him. She's completely innocent in all of this. And then comes the horrifying moment. Amnon, pretending, lures her into the room and forces himself on her. She resists. She speaks to him, saying, "No, my brother, don't force me. This is disgraceful. We can't do this." She even tells him to take it to their father, the king, because what he's doing is shameful and wrong. But Amnon doesn't listen, and after violating her, he doesn't show love, remorse, or even regret. Instead, he hates her. The lust that drove him evaporates, replaced by bitterness and scorn. He pushes her out of the room, locks the door behind her, and leaves her to face the aftermath alone. And this is where the human and cultural consequences hit hard. Tamar was a virgin, and in that culture, losing her virginity outside of marriage meant she was seen as socially compromised. She's facing shame, humiliation, and a drastically altered future, even though she did nothing wrong. She's mourning, grieving, and the weight of this injustice is crushing. You can feel the heartbreak in the text as she tears her ornate robe, the robe of a king's virgin daughter, and puts ashes on her head, a visible sign of mourning and disgrace. She runs to her full brother, Absalom, not her father, David. And here's where the story gets even more layered. David, the father, is passive. He's angry when he hears what happened, but he doesn't act. He doesn't comfort Tamar, doesn't confront Amnon, doesn't seek justice. His inaction speaks volumes and sets the stage for even more tragedy in the family. Tamar turns to Absalom, who loves her and is protective. He asks her to hold her peace for the moment, to not take the matter into her own hands yet. But she remains desolate, living with the grief and the cultural repercussions of the assault. And it's devastating. Tamar's grief is compounded by the injustice of having no support from her father, the passive inaction of the one who should protect her. Her pain isn't just emotional, it's practical, cultural, and social. She is left desolate in Absalom's house, grieving her lost innocence, her violated body, and her diminished social standing. And let's pause for a second and think about Amnon's perspective. Not to justify him, but to reflect on the human tragedy. His lust blinds him, his desire leads to violence, and the immediate gratification turns to hatred. This isn't just sin, it's a human failure on multiple levels, showing the destructive power of unchecked desire, poor counsel, and moral weakness. Jonadab's advice isn't incidental, it's pivotal. Without it, Amnon may have had a moment to reconsider, to restrain himself. Instead, he's guided into a scheme that culminates in irreversible harm. And that's such a human thing. Right? Bad counsel can amplify our worst impulses. So then Absalom's role begins to emerge. He's furious, but unlike David, he takes action, though it's more controlled at first. He watches, he notes, and he lets the tension build. And this is where we see the long-term consequences of both Amnon's sin and David's passivity. The seeds of bitterness, anger, and eventual violence are sown. Tamar's trauma doesn't resolve immediately. Her grief is ongoing, and the family dynamics start to unravel because the head of the household, the father, is failing to assert justice. And that's a really human and tragic element here. Families are affected not just by one person's sin, but by the failure of leadership and protection within the household. And the ripple effects continue. Over the next 2 years, Absalom cultivates his anger. He waits for the right moment, and it all traces back to this initial act of lust and betrayal. And to David's passivity. Time alone doesn't heal bitterness, and that's one of the big moral lessons embedded here. The emotional fallout, Tamar's grief, Absalom's brewing hatred, Amnon's self-destructive behavior is a direct consequence of sin compounded by inaction and poor advice. It's heartbreaking and human. You can almost feel the tension building, the unresolved emotions fermenting in this household. And the story makes it clear sin doesn't exist in a vacuum. The personal, social, and familial consequences are intertwined, often in ways that play out over years. And Tamar's response is particularly poignant. She doesn't hide her shame, but she also doesn't retaliate on her own. She seeks support, turns to Absalom, and allows her grief to be seen and shared. And that human response, grief, seeking comfort, showing vulnerability, is part of what makes her story resonate. It's raw, it's real, and it highlights the human cost of sin. And David's inaction contrasts sharply with Absalom's protective instincts. It underscores a really human truth when leaders fail to act. The burden falls on those who are vulnerable. An unresolved sin can poison the household. Tamar's plight becomes a catalyst for further tragedy in the family, showing how personal sin, compounded by passive leadership and bad counsel, can escalate into larger consequences. And it's not just about punishment, it's about the human cost, the grief, the betrayal, the fractured relationships, and the emotional fallout that affects everyone involved. You can feel the despair, the injustice, and the helplessness in her story. It's difficult to read, but it's a powerful depiction of how sin, unchecked desire, and the absence of protective action can devastate lives. Tamar's grief is palpable. Absalom's anger is brewing. Amnon is caught in his own destructive path. Jonadab's bad advice shows the danger of poor counsel, and David's passivity creates a vacuum of justice. And all of it is human. We see the complexity of emotion, the consequences of action and inaction, and the messy reality of human relationships. It's tragic, yes, but it's also instructive. The story of Amnon and Tamar teaches us about the destructive power of lust, the importance of wise counsel, the responsibility of leaders to protect the vulnerable, and the deep, lingering consequences of sin when it's not addressed. And the human elements, the grief, the betrayal, the protective instincts, and the failure of leadership make it all resonate. It's messy, it's emotional, and it's painfully real. And as we reflect on this, it's clear that the consequences of sin extend far beyond the moment of action. Tamar's grief, Absalom's hatred, the tension in the household, all of it traces back to a single moment of lust, compounded by poor guidance and inaction. And that's what makes this story so human, so tragic, and so powerful. It's a stark reminder of how personal sin and family dynamics can intertwine, creating ripples that affect everyone involved, and how the right actions or failures at the right time can change the course of many lives. Okay, so now we move into a really intense chapter of this story, Absalom and his response to what Amnon did to Tamar. And wow, this is heavy stuff, but it's also incredibly human. Absalom's anger is understandable, right? His sister has been violated, and David, their father, hasn't acted. But here's the thing, Absalom lets that anger sit, simmer, and fester. And that's the first lesson we get. Time alone doesn't heal bitterness. It doesn't magically make the wrongs go away. In fact, it often makes them grow stronger. For 2 years, Absalom nurtures this hatred toward Amnon every day, every interaction, every memory of that terrible act. He's feeding the fire. He's rehearsing it in his mind, thinking about what happened, how his sister was hurt, and how his father, the king, did nothing. And you can almost feel that tension building like a storm. It's the kind of simmering anger that doesn't just sit quietly, it shapes thoughts, plans, emotions. It's messy, it's consuming, and it's human. And then 2 years later, the opportunity comes. Absalom is at Baal Hazor, where he's holding the sheep shearing festival. Now, in those days, shearing sheep wasn't just about taking the wool. It was a big community event, a festive gathering. It's kind of like a mix between work and celebration, with plenty of people around. And here's where Absalom's plotting becomes chilling. He invites all the king's sons to attend, including Amnon. He sets the trap carefully. You can almost see him calculating every detail, making sure the moment is right. And when the time comes, he tells his servants to wait until Amnon is merry with wine. Then, the command strike Amnon and kill him. Be brave, don't hesitate, do exactly as I've instructed, and his servants obey. It's a brutal, premeditated act, and it shows just how dangerous unresolved bitterness can become. Now, think about this. Anger and pain, left unchecked, have grown into a plan that results in death. The initial injustice, the assault on Tamar, and David's passivity has created a cycle of vengeance. And this is something so human and so real when we let hurt fester. It can escalate beyond what we ever imagined. Absalom's actions, while understandable emotionally, are destructive, and they show how bitterness can warp perspective. And then the aftermath. Absalom flees immediately after the act. He knows the consequences of what he's done. He's aware of the moral and political fallout. And David, he's grief-stricken again. His household is fractured. His sons are in danger. And yet, here's the pattern repeating the king's passivity. He mourns, he feels the sorrow, but he doesn't actively confront the root of the problem. And that, honestly, is a stark lesson about leadership, justice, and personal responsibility. You see the interplay here. Anger left unresolved doesn't just harm the one it's directed toward, it harms everyone around. Families, communities, and even those carrying the anger are caught in the fallout. Absalom's hatred has grown over 2 years, and by the time he acts, it's not just righteous indignation, it's violent, calculated, and devastating. And that's why the story includes the point that time alone doesn't heal bitterness. Bitterness is like a seed if it's not dealt with. It grows roots, spreads, and eventually takes over. You might think waiting, hoping it will pass, or just ignoring it will help, but it doesn't. Instead, it feeds itself. And that's exactly what we see here. There's also a lesson about unforgiveness. Absalom could have chosen a different path. He could have sought justice through David, confronted Amnon with the hope of accountability, or even processed his anger in a way that didn't lead to bloodshed. But the bitterness, coupled with the lack of action from authority, created a space where vengeance seemed like the only option. And this is where the story becomes reflective, because we can see the dangers in real life too. When we carry unresolved anger, when we don't deal with hurt in a healthy way, it changes us. It can dictate decisions, distort our perspective, and ultimately harm those around us. Absalom's story is an extreme example, yes, but the principles are deeply human. And there's another layer, the ripple effect. When he acts, not only does Amnon die, but the entire family is shaken. David mourns, the other brothers flee in fear, and the household is thrown into chaos. Bitterness and vengeance don't just affect the person who holds the anger they spread, touching everyone nearby. And we also see something about timing and patience. 2 years passed before Absalom acted. That delay didn't heal his anger, it allowed it to grow more potent, more dangerous, and more consuming. It's a reminder that unresolved hurt, left unattended, can fester into destructive action. And you can almost feel the tension and dread in the narrative as the festival unfolds. Everyone's enjoying themselves. The sheep are being sheared, and Amnon is unsuspecting, completely unaware that the man he wronged is orchestrating this elaborate revenge. The contrast between the festive atmosphere and the brewing violence is stark, and it adds to the human drama of the story. And then, after the act, Absalom flees to Talmai, the king of Geshur, his mother's father. He seeks refuge, leaving his home and family behind. And David mourns daily for Amnon, but Absalom remains away, and the family tension lingers. The story doesn't immediately resolve. The aftermath of anger, vengeance, and unaddressed hurt continues to reverberate. And that's so human, isn't it? Sometimes our actions, especially when driven by unresolved emotions, have long-term consequences that aren't immediately fixed. They echo and affect relationships, trust, and family dynamics. So reflecting on all this, we see a few key lessons. Bitterness doesn't disappear on its own. Time alone isn't enough. Without forgiveness, without addressing anger, our emotions can turn destructive. Unforgiveness can warp judgment, lead to planning revenge, and hurt everyone involved, even those we care about. And the narrative also shows us the importance of timely action and accountability. If David had confronted Amnon, sought justice for Tamar, or actively addressed the situation, the cycle of bitterness might have been mitigated, but the lack of action allowed hatred and resentment to grow unchecked. And that's a sobering, very human reminder for all of us. Emotions are powerful, pain is real, and how we respond to hurt, whether with forgiveness, confrontation, or destructive planning, can define the trajectory of relationships and lives. Absalom's story is tragic, yes, but it's instructive. It's a reflection on human nature, the dangers of unresolved anger, and the destructive potential of bitterness. And when we read it, it's impossible not to think about the ripple effects in our own lives. Bitterness left to fester doesn't stay contained. It spreads, it influences, and it can dictate choices in ways we might regret. And the story doesn't shy away from showing that, in all its human messiness, its sorrow, and its dramatic consequences. It's reflective, it's cautionary, and it's deeply, painfully real. And that's what makes it so compelling. It's not just a historical account. It's a study in human emotion, morality, and the long-reaching impact of anger and unforgiveness. So when we look at Absalom, Amnon, Tamar, and David, we see a complex web of choices, emotions, and consequences. We see that unresolved bitterness doesn't heal itself, that vengeance has a cost, and that unforgiveness can poison relationships and families. And we also see the human element in all of this, the fear, the rage, the grief, and the desperate need for justice and reconciliation. It's heavy, yes, but it's real, and it's a story that resonates because we've all seen the effects of bitterness and anger, even if not to this extreme. And that's why this part of the story is so reflective and so important. It's a moral lesson wrapped in a deeply human narrative, showing us both the dangers of unresolved emotion and the necessity of confronting hurt and seeking healing before it spirals out of control. So, now let's take a step back and look at David in the midst of all this family chaos. His household has just been rocked. Amnon, his eldest, is dead at the hands of Absalom, and Tamar is left devastated and unprotected. And David, well, he's grieving, obviously. The text tells us he mourned for Amnon every single day, and you can feel that sorrow. But here's the hard truth, mourning alone isn't enough. He longs to see Absalom, but he doesn't act. He doesn't confront his son, doesn't attempt reconciliation, and doesn't set the boundaries that could have begun healing the family. This passivity, it's tragic because it leaves the wounds to fester. It's a classic example of what happens when parents fail to engage with the brokenness in their own household. When you don't address issues, when you leave hurt unacknowledged or uncorrected, it breeds more pain, more resentment, and more dysfunction. David's passivity also reflects a deeper struggle with moral authority. After his own sins with Bathsheba and the fallout from that, he's in a delicate position. How can he confront Amnon for wrongdoing when he himself has been guilty of serious sin? And that's so human, right? We've all felt moments where our own failings make it hard to lead, to confront, or to correct. And David's story shows the ripple effect of that struggle. Because he doesn't assert his authority in a timely, just way, Absalom takes matters into his own hands. Tamar is left with grief and no formal support, and the family tension escalates. And notice how this isn't just about punishment, it's about relationships. Passive parenting, in this case, doesn't teach accountability. It doesn't protect the vulnerable. And it leaves unresolved emotional wounds, which only grow over time. There's this human element here. David's grief is genuine. His longing for Absalom is real, but his inaction demonstrates the limitations of emotion without intervention. Mourning and yearning don't automatically resolve broken dynamics or restore trust. And this is where the lesson resonates beyond the biblical narrative. In families, in communities, in relationships, passive responses to wrongdoing or hurt tend to compound problems. The initial injustice, Amnon's sin against Tamar, becomes a catalyst for ongoing conflict, resentment, and even violence. By not addressing it, David inadvertently allows the cycle to continue. And it's relatable, too, in a modern sense. How often do we struggle to confront wrongdoing in our own circles because we feel guilty about our past mistakes or because we just don't know what to do? But David's story is clear. Failing to act allows unresolved issues to take root and fester. And there's a subtle but important point here about moral authority. David's personal sin complicates his ability to lead and correct effectively. This is a profoundly human struggle, the challenge of holding others accountable while feeling your own integrity has been compromised. And when moral authority is weakened, the temptation is to withdraw, to grieve quietly, to hope things will resolve themselves. But the story shows that this kind of passivity has real consequences. Families, like David's, experience compounded hurt when leaders step back instead of stepping in. And David's longing for Absalom underscores the tension. He wants reconciliation, he wants connection, but he doesn't actively pursue it. The longing is there, but action is absent, and that gap is what allows the bitterness, the grief, and the unresolved tensions to linger. It's so human because we can understand wanting to fix things but feeling incapable or unworthy due to our own past mistakes. And yet, inaction doesn't resolve anything. It only leaves the door open for further conflict. So, in reflecting on David's passivity, we see multiple layers. There's grief and genuine sorrow, there's longing and emotional engagement, but there's also a failure to exercise authority, to confront wrongdoing, and to create a path toward resolution. And that combination produces long-term relational problems. Tamar remains desolate, Absalom's anger grows, and the household dynamics become increasingly strained. The story illustrates the consequences of emotional but inactive leadership, and it resonates with the human experience of trying to navigate authority, guilt, and responsibility. David's struggle is tragic but instructive. It shows the relational cost of failing to act, the danger of unresolved issues, and the challenge of maintaining moral authority after personal failure. And while it's a specific historical narrative, the principles are deeply human. Grief without action can't heal broken relationships. Longing without intervention leaves tensions unresolved, and passive leadership in the face of wrongdoing often produces more problems than it prevents. So this chapter of David's life reminds us that leadership, whether in a family, community, or personal context, requires more than feeling. It requires action, accountability, and courage, even when we ourselves feel flawed or compromised. Because failing to act doesn't protect anyone, it just lets bitterness and dysfunction grow. So, looking back at David's story, it's wild, right? We see sin, deep mistakes, heartbreak, repentance, and the ripple of consequences that follow. And yet, we also see forgiveness, restoration, and the chance to start over, even after failure. The big takeaway? Don't let bitterness linger. Deal with hurt and face wrongs honestly. Life is messy. Families are messy. But grace is real. If this story resonated with you, consider hitting like and subscribing so you don't miss more stories packed with these lessons.